What's the weirdest thing a medical professional has casually said to you? Story 1. After destroying my knee riding BMX at 17, the emergency surgeon said, "Wow, really messed that up." 10 years later and another serious knee injury from riding, I saw the same surgeon. He did a great job on the first one. The first words out of his mouth were, "I remember you. Messed up the other one, huh?" When I was 17, I had surgery for a torsion of the testicle. 15 years later, again, for a bladder stone. Hey, that scar looks familiar. I ever do work on you? Hilariously, a couple of years later, 3,000 miles away in a different province, ER for a really bad UTI. Doc is checking stuff and says, "Hey, did Dr. Chin do that surgery? That man is a master. Nobody cuts like that." I once was in the ER for severe abdominal pain that was located around my appendix and had been going on for days. Nothing else had been out of whack, and I mean nothing. I got an abdominal CT, and when he came in with the results, grinned and told me I was just severely constipated. So it turns out, you're just full of crap. I laughed and asked him how long he had been waiting to use that one on a patient, and he said, a very long time. He was a very jokey guy and just had to wait for a constipated patient who he knew would laugh and not complain. I actually don't mind doctors like these. Story 2. Was living in a foreign country and had a cold, flu-type illness. Went to the doctor and he came in eating a bowl of cereal, already weird. Checks some things and says, "Do you know what AIDS is?" I'm in complete shock and say, "Yes, I do." He follows up with, "It's a virus and there is no cure." Goes on to explain why there is no cure, all while I'm seeing my life over as I know it. Finally ends with, "But you don't have that virus. You have a different one, much more common and treatable. But I wanted you to understand why an antibiotic wouldn't work." Still in shock, I'm like, "So I don't have AIDS then, right?" He goes, "No," and walks out. What a roller coaster. This was in Switzerland about 15 years ago, and I'm American. Yes, he was slurping his cereal the whole time. I have a friend of a friend who told the hilarious story of how he got a hair transplant in Turkey. So he flew to Turkey to get it done because it's way cheaper than the US. His mom is also a flight attendant, so she was able to get cheap tickets through her airline. They went overseas together and toured around before the doctor's visit. The day before the surgery, he had to get blood work done to make sure he was healthy enough for surgery. The next morning, he gets a call from the doctor telling him to come there in person. He starts to get a little worried because that's sort of freaky to hear. The doctor sits him down and asks his mom to leave the room. "You have AIDS." The guy calmly accepts the news and leaves to go back to the hotel. He told his mom. She asked things like, "How long have you been gay?" The guy is straight and confused as to when and how he got the virus. His mom is super supportive though. She wants to go shopping at one of the cultural POIs they were near to take his mind off the bad news, while her son was just not having it and sulked in the hotel room. Understandable. The guy sits on the news for the entire weekend. Then the doctor called again on Monday and was like, "We got your blood mixed up with another patient. You don't have AIDS. We can have you come in for surgery at X time." Obvious relief from the guy and his mom. I just thought this story was so crazy and went through a roller coaster of emotions when he told it. It's also kind of cute to know that his mom was extremely supportive of her closeted gay but actually straight son. I understand you don't have to be gay or have gay sex to contract HIV or AIDS, but there's definitely an association between the two in the public's knowledge of the virus. This literally happened to me too. I was 19 years old and at a community clinic and was told that to get birth control I needed to get tested for HIV. The doctor tested me and then came back into the room and said, "What would you do if I told you you have AIDS?" I said, "Are you saying I have AIDS?" He said, "No, we don't find out until your results come back, but I like to get people prepared." Needless to say, I didn't have AIDS, but I did have a week-long panic attack until my results came back. That's just cruel. Story 3. When I was like 20, my endocrinologist took a good look at me and asked, "Are you okay with your face being so asymmetrical?" I had never really noticed it before, but boy have I noticed it since. I'll never forget the first time I got my legs waxed. I was 23 and in Australia. I'm Irish. The woman doing it was probably in her 50s. She was making the usual chit-chat when out of the blue she asked me if I'd lost a lot of weight recently. I said no, and she was like, "Oh, it's just that you have loads of stretch marks on your legs." I knew I had some behind my knees and thighs, but it wasn't something that I really noticed. I remember thinking it was such an odd thing for her to say. She's working in the beauty industry and should be making me feel good, but what she said could have given me a complex. Thankfully it didn't, but from time to time I remember that exchange and think about what an insensitive bee she was. When I was a young teen, I needed to get my wisdom teeth removed. The office where my mom took me also did cosmetic surgery. The doctor took us into his office, looked at me and said to my mom, "She has an underdeveloped chin. We could fix that." I hadn't realized anything was wrong with my chin until that moment, but the doc did give me a habit that sticks with me into my 30s of flexing my neck and pushing my chin out. I'm glad to find I'm not the only one who was given a complex by a medical professional. I was in my late 20s when diagnosed with thyroid disease. My PCP sent me to an endocrinologist who told me I must hate myself because I was fat. This was a lead up to him handing me a brochure for a fat camp for adults that lasted for 6 months. What about my husband? What about my job? My family? He was the most arrogant man I've ever met. I got the last laugh around 12 or so years ago when his office was raided by the FBI and DEA and he was arrested for selling and writing excessive prescriptions for opioids and for murdering his soon-to-be ex-wife. A lot of these doctors just want more business, so they prey on insecurities. Story 4. I had a doctor tell me that my metabolism is so slow that I would do very well in an apocalypse. My doctor told me this when he noticed my chronic low body temperature and asked me other questions about weight gain and pooping frequency. He said, "Some people are just built to hibernate. You're just like hibernating all the time." This was in the same conversation where he diagnosed me with a sleep disorder too. Can't even hibernate properly. This is me. All my life I've been like this. Always chubby and never losing weight no matter how hard I try. Let me say this up front before y'all go crazy. I absolutely do not have an eating disorder. I can go literal days without eating. I'm not hungry either, and I'm not starving myself. In fact, there are plenty of times when I have to sit down and think, when did I last eat? 2 days ago? Crazy, I'm not hungry at all. Well, I should probably get some food then. This isn't an uncommon thing either, but typically I eat 1 meal a day and it's usually after work. On the other hand, for maybe 2 to 3 days a month, I have an insatiable appetite and eat anything in sight, loading up for my hibernation, I guess. Same. My endocrinologist said if you weren't sitting in front of me and someone handed me this chart, I'd think it was a prepubescent girl. I was 6'3", 280 pounds, and 25 years old. I was sent to an endocrinologist because the biggest hospital in the state hooked me up to something called a calorimeter, and my BMR was around 1,720 calories. I'd been sent to the hospital by another doctor because after a sports injury, I gained weight terrifyingly fast and continued to gain weight on a supervised 2,000 calorie diet. Also, apparently I breathe really slowly, 6 to 8 breaths per minute, and my resting heart rate was 63 to 70 BPM. Nothing is all too impressive until you factor in, once again, 280 pounds. The doctor who read the calorimeter results was fascinated with me. Maybe that's why I can't lose weight. Story 5. If you don't mind, I'd like to show everyone pictures of your tonsils. According to her, I had the most disgusting tonsils she had ever seen in her years in the business, and gosh darn she wanted to show them off. I had a similar experience at a dentist. I apparently had a very rare problem, and even the oldest doctor had only seen this 2 times in his life. For the next few sessions, all other doctors were called in and he showed them it. I was fine with it, but it was an odd situation sitting on the dentist chair for 4 doctors and a few nurses that were around you and looked very interested in what would happen next. So I was the real-life example for a textbook lecture. Reminds me of a time when I took my cat to the vet. It was time for him to get sterilized, but during the appointment, the vet discovered that his testicles had never descended. It caused a small sensation in the office, and every single vet and trainee vet in that office wanted to feel his empty ball sack. After the second person copped a feel, my cat started squirming. By the 5th, he drew blood. "All right," the vet said, as she withdrew her shredded finger. "I guess we deserved that. They didn't wait until the poor kitty was under first." Story 6. My previous OBGYN came through my line at my old job. For some reason, I blanked out who he was. Like I knew him, but for the life of me, I couldn't remember how. He saw I was struggling and said, "Don't you remember me? I'll give you a hint. Last time I saw you, you were in my office with your ankles in the air." Loudly in front of a line of little old ladies fresh from church wanting to buy flowers from the garden center. He was an amazing doctor and figured out what was wrong with me when no other doctor could, but at that moment, the embarrassment could have killed me. It's hilarious to me how easily we see people in their uniforms and not their faces. I work at a port, and I'm always in my full regalia. Black pants, white shirt, high visibility vest, toque on my head. I came in one day on my day off, and a man who I worked with every single day asked if he could help me. I was in normal people's clothes, but happened to have my work hat in my pocket. I put it on, and he immediately recognized me. He and the nurse from my breast surgeon should meet. I bumped into her shopping for shoes, and after the "Hi, how are you?" she asks how my boobs are doing, as I had loads of complications, before telling me that they look fantastic. The looks of the other shoppers were priceless. She was the best nurse. I wouldn't have made it through both surgeries and post-ops without her. I guess public burns aren't covered under do no harm. Story 7. When my girlfriend was in the ICU, one of the nurses sort of shrugged and said dismissively, "She's gonna die anyhow." She should have. Her kidneys had shut completely down, and she was so swollen that her tongue wouldn't fit in her mouth. We were making the decision whether to continue life support or not. She didn't die. A month and a half later, she walked out of the hospital and into my car for the ride home. She was a salty old nurse with 1,000,000 miles on her. She would have been right had the stars and planets not all been aligned perfectly. A year after she left the hospital, we visited the ICU doctor, and he said most people who show up with her issue don't even make it past the ER and up to his floor. Nobody expected her to live past the first few hours. They said that even moving her bed from that room would have killed her because she was doing so badly. She didn't open her eyes until 3 days later. She went code blue 3 times before leaving the ICU, once with me and her elderly mother right there. That nurse wasn't wrong, and she only said it to me outside the earshot of her family. I'm pragmatic enough to understand without emotion. My response was that she might, but until then, we're gonna fight for her. As an ICU nurse who works in a surgical/trauma unit, aka patients dying is a pretty common occurrence around there, I cringed reading this. Not because that nurse shouldn't have said the things she did, she likely meant well and has just had her bedside manner chipped away at over the years, but because I've definitely said similar things and I often forget how cruel our words or thoughts can seem to people outside the profession. I never say things of that sort around any family members or loved ones, and will be double checking my surroundings now for a few weeks after this comment. But sometimes it's just true. People die, and I see a lot of people in situations in which death would likely be the better outcome. There certainly are fates much worse than dying, but family members don't need to hear that when they come to us, at least not in that acute moment. Thanks for the reminder, and I am very happy to hear about your girlfriend's recovery. When I was in the hospital 22 weeks pregnant and having contractions, one of the nurses was absolutely certain I'd be losing the baby. Thankfully, I didn't hear about it until after I was released and on bed rest from my OBGYN. My doc was so pissed at that nurse, and the baby made it to full term. Nyeh. Sometimes a doctor's intuition isn't always correct. Story 8. If you ever tried to have a baby, the kid would snap your pelvis in two and rip you in half. Said by my gynecological surgeon. He said it in the most casual manner. I was mortified. ETA, thank goodness I was there to get a hysterectomy. I was told the opposite. My first baby came in about 40 minutes and my second came in half that. So fast, the OB barely had time to get to the room after being paged, and the nurses had to tell me to stop pushing. 4 separate medical professionals independently told me that I was very good at having babies in an impressed voice that seemed like they were genuinely admiring an important skill. So apparently I know that my most unique talent is physically extruding babies, which will literally never come up again. Yeah, when I was in nursing school for my RN, my instructor had been a midwife for decades. Being an instructor was just her retirement job. We were discussing OB stuff one day, and I forget why I was singled out, but she said she would never ever want to have you as a patient. Your proportions make childbirth a near-death sentence for you. Yay to me turning out to be asexual, and therefore not having to worry about that, I guess, definitely stuck with me regardless. Some of these doctors can be a bit too blunt. Story 9. If you want to help people, don't go into medicine. As a doctor, I'm nothing more than a people mechanic, and much like a car mechanic, I patch people back together well enough to get them out the door until I see them again. If I could go back, I'd run as far away from medicine as I could. For context, this sentiment was offered to me by a 70-year-old, 40-plus year tenured physician who was on more boards than I care to list and was a very well-respected surgeon. As many in the comments have stated, his distaste for the job had very much to do with the long list of hoops that he'd have to jump through in order to order and perform even the most basic treatments. and yes, the endless charting was exhaustive to witness, much less perform. He also went so far as to send a hospital-wide email asking any physician who had the time to sit in a meeting with all of the pre-med people who had dedicated the most time to shadowing for a brief back and forth. Asked a few questions along the lines of who's unhappy with their job, how many have been divorced, how many think you're overworked, how many would go back to med school, especially with the debt load today, and a few more questions that painted a very, at least with this test group of 40 plus people, realistic picture of how unhappy they all were. At least 80% raised their hands in favor of the most negative option presented and briefly attested to how bad and hard the job had been. And of those that were heavily in favor of the job, I'd say at least 80% were quite obviously there for the money and nothing more. I still have an immense respect for those who choose to work in healthcare, but I'm also glad that I steered away from it, especially when I consider that I would have entered residency in the midst of a pandemic. Whew, sounds similar to what I hear from teachers. They got into it to help, but the system is broken. Some people don't actually want to make the long-term changes to help themselves or their kids, etc. I finally found a job teaching at a private preschool where I'm respected and feel like I'm doing some good. I previously wanted to teach special ed in the public school system, but every special ed teacher I met warned me not to. Many of them got frustrated with the whole thing and quit to do something else. Always the best ones who cared the most. What I say to people who want to go into medicine to help people, well, you want to help people, but they make it so hard. For example, patient has a bladder infection, so you prescribe an antibiotic to make them feel better. Though it's a generic antibiotic, the insurance refuses to pay for it. They want you to prescribe something else first that you know won't work. It's only $60, but the patient can't afford it. You argue with the insurance for 2 days, so the patient gets a kidney infection and then sepsis and then ends up in the ICU. They nearly die and spend 2 weeks there at a cost of about $200,000. So you call the insurance medical director to ask why they nearly killed your patient and spent $199,940 extra to do it. The medical director says it's our job to make sure you are prescribing correctly, and you are so baffled by that response you hang up. Then the insurance sends a health resilience officer to the clinic to reprimand you on your patients who are spending too much on the insurance's money. They call these patients high utilizers. That first patient they reprimand you on, that very patient they nearly killed denying that antibiotic. Repeat the scenario 40 times a month, and you wonder where the helping people part went. There really is a very thin line between wanting to help people and wanting to earn money. Story 10. I live in Ireland, and the surgeon who replaced my hip is also a farmer. The day before I was due to be discharged, he came in on his rounds. He said, "I may or may not see you tomorrow, it depends on the dog." So I said, "Okay, what's up with the dog?" He told me the dog broke his leg and was having it set tomorrow, but he wasn't sure what time. So I said, "Sure, bring in the old dog and I'll mind him." This is rural Ireland, bear in mind, and I was in the convalescent area of the hospital by then, and shortly after breakfast he arrived in with the dog, lovely border collie with his leg in plaster. He stayed with me watching TV till the doc was finished replacing another hip and was ready to discharge me, and we could all go home. It could only happen in Ireland. He was a trauma surgeon who went by the Red Duke in Houston. He owned a ranch and was a real cowboy. He would roam the halls with his 2 golden retrievers. Eventually I had to keep them in med school. He brought the use of helicopter ambulances to the US. He was in the Vietnam War and drove a tank. Whenever a resident was upset after losing a patient, he would gently comfort them and then say in his military bravado, "Besides, you're not a killer, I'm a killer. I've killed more people than you ever will." The accent really comes out when you're delirious, huh? People don't usually ask where I'm from, but when I was in labor, the nurses kept asking. That was when I knew I was going to need an epidural. Story 11. Not me, but mom. She's in remission for a non-Hodgkin's lymphoma that invaded her brain. She was getting a scan to confirm the cancer had left her brain pan, and the doctor came in and said, "Good news, we've scanned your brain and confirmed that there's nothing in there." I know he was joking, but there was at least one instance where a patient walked into a clinic to get a brain scan to figure out why he had headaches, only for all the doctors to be absolutely shocked when it looked like he had no brain, just an empty skull. Turns out the guy had a condition where fluid fluid would leak and build up in his skull. He used to have this fluid regularly drained, but he either stopped going or his doctors falsely assumed he was cured. I don't remember. As the fluid slowly built up over the years, it just kinda slowly pushed his brain until it was lining the inside of his skull. The brain is squishy enough and the fluid buildup was just slow enough that it didn't affect his physical or mental capacities at all until there was no room left for his brain to go. The headaches were from his brain slowly being crushed against his skull. No idea how the guy is doing now or how they treated that issue. My assumption would be that you can't just drain all that fluid at once without causing brain damage, but I'm no doctor. The guy had hydrocephalus. Sometimes people get a shunt that drains the fluid to the belly, or sometimes it doesn't squish the brain too much, so it just gets monitored. I imagine this guy had a shunt placed to drain some of that fluid. I know plenty of people have been okay when shunts are placed in later in life. Impossible to say if this guy was alright. I actually have a shunt. Got it at 3 years old because an ill-placed tumor was blocking the fluids, causing hydrocephalus. The tumor itself is non-volatile, basically just sitting there blocking the road, but because of the placement they couldn't completely remove it, and I was monitored until I was 19. 4 times a year at first, then 2 times, then once per year until they decided 4 years was enough. Because the chance of my state changing was so slim after all that time, the tumor actually shrunk when I was 5 or so, but never changed after. What I find surprising about that story is that headaches supposedly were the only symptom. I live with constant balancing issues and pretty hefty motor skill issues on my right-hand side, and before the shunt installation I suffered from massive headaches. That part checks out to the point of vomiting, which happened once after because of a growth spurt in puberty. Puberty can really mess you up. Story 12. I was a teen and seeing my pediatrician. There was a baby or infant in another room wailing its head off. After a few minutes, my doctor said, "Don't mind him, we just chopped his leg off." That reminds me of a doctor I went to get skin tags removed. He was literally just using scissors, so after he was done I looked like I had wrestled with a cheese grater. I'm trying not to yell, but one good one made me say, "Fuck!" really loud. I instantly apologized and he said, "Oh, no worries, my 5-year-old says worse." This kills me because I work in a mostly pediatric dental office and all you can hear is kids screaming bloody murder all day. Most of the time, someone is just trying to use a Spider-Man toothbrush to brush their teeth. The older patients are understandably always so freaked out though. My pediatrician acted really similar to this. Lovely guy, very funny. Story 13. I was 18 at the time and went to the family doctor that brought me into this world. The reason was I was having great pain urinating and was leaking a pus-like substance. After getting a shot, I went to his office. I sat down and he lit a Winston, rocked back and forth in his chair whilst taking a big drag and said, "I'm going to talk to you like a Dutch uncle. If you do not know if it is clean, keep your goddamn zipper zipped up." My brother got scabies once. Scabies are little bugs that cause little scabs all over your body, but they particularly like a warm, damp area. So guess where they go first? My brother showed this to the doctor. He says, "Have you been putting that somewhere you shouldn't?" Lived in Florida for a while. Down there, some beaches have the insects colloquially called no-see-ums because they're so small they're invisible to the naked eye, but they attack your feet and ankles and their bites hurt like absolute bee. Then in my 20s, I briefly worked as a delivery driver for a pharmaceutical company that delivered drugs to nursing homes 24/7. I had no idea what scabies were, never heard of them, but some must have jumped on me at one of these nursing homes. I thought the bites on my ankles were from no-see-ums and would go away. But over the next few days they migrated up to my crotch and holy crap, the pain and itchiness were insane. Made an emergency visit to a clinic that explained what they were and gave me a cream for them. Holy crap, that was horrible. No-see-ums sound like the bugs of my nightmares. Story 14. I'm just going to kind of tack it on. It'll probably hold, while having my fingertip reattached after a freak accident. As I left the ER, a different medical professional said to me, "Oh wow, they saved it? We were for sure that you were going to lose it. We even placed bets." ETA, the whoops, was a comment the doctor made after putting in one of those stitches. It did not inspire confidence. A girl at work lost the tip of her finger. They collected it and put it on ice while waiting for the ambulance. She had other injuries. They were unsure about moving her. Someone realized they hadn't taken the finger with them, so they called the person who accompanied the ambulance and were told they wouldn't be able to use it. So they just put it in the freezer for a few weeks until someone decided to ask her if she wanted it or if we could throw it away. When I was 20, I was having surgery to remove a ganglion cyst and scar tissue. I heard, okay, that's fine. It wasn't fine. I got a boutonniere deformity, nerve damage, can't bend it, and the loss of functionality in my hand. I've been to physical therapy a few times, but using it makes it much worse. When I use my right hand, all of my fingers curl in and cramp up, which is literally the worst pain I've ever felt. I often faint or puke during these cramps because of the botched surgery. I lost an art scholarship and the ability to write, along with all of my other hobbies. I want an elective surgery to deaden the nerve and have a ray amputation. My entire family has been so supportive from the very start to helping me decide what to do next. I'm 24 now. When I went back to him to see if he would help, he said, no, you don't have nerve damage. You just need to go back to therapy again, and in a few years, you will be as good as new. I mean, you have nothing left to lose anyway. Ha, wow, that's harsh. Story 15. I snapped both of my Achilles while finishing off a set of heavy leg presses with calf extensions. I didn't close it all the way, and the sled crashed down on me, pinning my legs next to my head. Yes, I was dumb not to use the safety pins. They weren't there. They constantly disappeared to other machines, so I was lazy for not using them and paid the price. The doctor looked at my scans and said, "These are mirror images of each other. You must have had good form." I ruptured my Achilles this year, mowing the grass, go figure. I went to the ER and the door to the exam room was open. Every doctor and nurse that walked by asked what I had. When they heard it was Achilles, they all had the same response. Ooh, yikes. The mental image of that is brutal, though I'm trying to picture why it was that your Achilles took the brunt of it, and not anything else. Tendons are notoriously difficult to recover from. I wonder if your knee dislocated or your hip ball socket. You would have had an easier recovery. It was oddly sweet though. Story 16. I go to urgent care because I have an earache and may have an ear infection. The nurse asks if I'm on any medication and I tell her about my IUD. She says, I could never have an IUD or even take birth control, since that's murder and all, but hey, you do whatever makes you happy. ETA, I did report her and she did get in trouble. I just had to go to the hospital for intensive pelvic pain. I had a tubal ligation a few months ago. When I tell this to the previously very nice ultrasound technician, she goes on this weird rant about how old you are. They gave you a tubal ligation at 30? You sure you don't want children? I don't even know what to say. All while she had the ultrasound wand up my vagina. Very uncomfortable and also insane how 30 is apparently too young to decide I don't want kids. I'm not 12. Yeah, my spouse had a doctor who refused to attest to her medical condition so that she could get her medical marijuana card. He said he had thought about it and then said he was concerned about what his lord would say. I'm pretty sure his lord is going to tell him, "You idiot, you refused to give my gifts to anyone who needed it. To hell with you." Story 17. A nurse of some kind took my blood pressure. He asked what the numbers were. I asked, "Is that good?" He said, "I'm not qualified to give you a professional opinion on the matter. You should ask your doctor." I asked, "But unprofessionally, is that good?" He said, "Unprofessionally? Well, in my purely personal opinion that I am sharing with you as an individual and not in any medical or official capacity whatsoever, you should buy stronger deodorant." For clarity, I was definitely stinky. I was homeless at the time. I was well aware of this fact. If you're worried you're a little funky, don't. You would almost assuredly notice if you smelled really bad. A bit harsh, but maybe that brutal honesty was needed. Story 18. Was on a 72-hour hold following an attempt on my life on the anniversary of a traumatic event, and had a nurse ask if she could pray for me. I'm not religious, but I thought it was nice, and it was 2 a.m. and I was tired, so I said sure. She proceeded to pray out loud for 30 minutes, asking Jesus to forgive me for the huge sin I had committed. Not the direction I thought she'd go, lol, but just said a very awkward thank you after and went back to sleep. My husband was in end-stage cancer and was being cared for at home. We had a palliative care nurse in each day for an hour or so. One of them suggested he pray the pain away instead of giving him meds. One call to the center and she was taken off our roster. Not a doctor, but I was a sub-teacher at my local Head Start in rural Florida. I had been out for a few days with a bladder infection. I mentioned it offhand to the teacher I was working with when I came back the first time I met her. She asked if she could pray for me as I was leaving, and I said sure, thinking she meant at her church. She laid her hands on my shoulders and prayed over me for a good 10 minutes while I stood there awkwardly, asking God to force this illness from my body and keep the demons away. She was like 5 inches from my face, leaning over me. I can only imagine what my supervisor watching on the cameras must have thought was happening. Keep it out of the hospitals. Thank you so much for watching to the end. If you have a similar story to these that you would like to share with us, please leave it in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please leave us a like and don't forget to subscribe if you have not done so yet. For more videos like this one right now, please stop by our channel. Thanks again and see you next time.